Logical Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. When many people think about science, it seems like something almost alien to them. They know that somewhere, a strange breed of humanity is speaking in incomprehensible terms about highly abstract concepts while conducting experiments that boggle the average mind. But it is totally separate from them until it trickles down to consumer technology. This is a bit of trickery, however. Unlike Sheldon Cooper from the hit TV show The Big Bang Theory, most scientists are indistinguishable from your garden variety person. They speak much differently than they write. They ground abstract concepts in concrete experiences. And their experiments are conducted with the same tools that you use at your job, the mind and the hands. Scientists are similar to normal humans in other ways, too. They take pride in their work. They don't enjoy being wrong, and they get excited about possibilities, even if they're just mathematical. Sometimes this leads to outcomes that aren't wholly what we expect of the lofty title of science. But how can we know as lay people? Sabine Hossenfelder, author of the book Existential Physics, set out to explain just that for us.
Nice.
Yeah, so we've talked about this book quite a bit over probably the past several months. I think every week or every other week she pops up in the conversation.
She does. As
we were going through reading. But we finished the book and we said, you know what, today's the day. We'll go ahead and examine it. So do you want to give the listeners a brief overview of existential physics?
Well, to start, I'll just say this about Hossenfelder. Really, I'm going to quote John Horgan as a writer, a science writer that I've also appreciated, and Lawrence Krauss. And this is on the back of the book. But here's a relatively young physicist. Horgan says, I don't always agree with her, but I'm always eager to hear what she has to say. She's one of the boldest young thinkers, and not just in physics. And Lawrence Krauss, who wrote a book some time back called The Physics of Star Trek, which I always enjoyed. It says she's part gonzo journalist, part curious child, part teacher, and part accomplished researcher. A unique writing talent and a unique science popularizer. And one cannot help but be provoked by her. Existential Physics, which is her newest book, is one that in which she unabashedly goes to the roots of science in philosophy, which Joel and I talked about and will continue to talk about, and will very handily refer to any number of philosophers one would recognize or once heard the name of, or we've talked about from time to time. But she does so in a way to try to emphasize what, from her view as a physicist, where philosophy is useful and important, and where the lines are in physics. So I popularized ideas, and she herself is popularizing physics by bringing it to lay people to read. It's still a challenge to read. It's not like it's not a romance novel, but which are fun, but this requires some investment. Still, it's to bring physics to those of us who are not physicists and to invite us in. And she does that while at the same time drawing some lines. So she's provokes because she says things you don't necessarily want to hear. She tells you why she thinks you probably don't want to hear them. And then she sometimes says, I'm paraphrasing, it's okay if you want to believe this. It just has nothing to do with science.
Right. Yeah, so that's great, because I think that really does capture the spirit of the book. And there's a lot in there that is very cogent to what you and I talk about on a weekly basis. The one that sticks out to me, and the one that I think would really, kind of catch in her craw a little bit, is this idea of categorization again. And so you and I pretty much on a weekly basis talk about how categorization, whether it's just in linguistic terms or whether it's in abstract conceptualizations or whatever it may be, we try to define things. And what we find over and over again is that in trying to define things, we realize that the things in themselves, which is a philosophical term,
Yes.
are very hard or almost impossible to sort of get around. Now, for a physicist, the entire paradigm is shifted, right? Your whole job, your whole sort of inquiry is focused around categorization. Is focused around empirically delineating concepts and then discovering mathematical ways of giving them meaning or significance.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where, as you and I have been reading the book, things pop out where we go, oh, hey, man, this was really well written. She had a good point here. And then there's other times where we go, well, I don't know if I agree with her on this, because the viewpoint of a philosopher and the viewpoint of a physicist are so wildly different. I'm going to apologize to the listeners ahead of time. I live on a quiet street, but they must be doing construction outside.
I think they are snow plowing or something.
Yeah, so I have, I'll try to use my audio mixing skills to get rid of as much of it as I can. But if you're hearing some background noise, that's probably what it is.
Either that or our brains are great.
Yeah, that could be it too. This one's going to put us through our paces a little bit. So what are some of the main themes that she addresses in the book?
Well, let's consider some of the, I think, because I'd like other people to read this. So here's some selections just from the table of contents. Is math all there is? Why doesn't anyone ever get younger? Is knowledge predictable? Has physics ruled out free will? Is consciousness computable? Does the universe think? Can we create a universe? And what's the purpose of anything anyway? Now, just from those things, she is delightful I love reading her essays and continuing to read her work because she's obviously, there's no question of her bona fides, of her superior qualifications in physics, of the brilliance of her mind and the capacity to bring this all to us. So I do hats off to her. But she does it in a way that invites you by that poking, sort of a Socratic way of gadflying and tossing statements out that you say, now, wait a minute.
Right.
You just said, and I'd like to picture her smiling and saying, yes, I did. So what?
Right. Yeah. And again, that's where this paradigm shift of the philosopher versus the physicist kind of comes in. And then I can tell you, if you read through that table of contents, right, many of those titles are very philosophical in nature. The questions that they're asking. But what I found interesting about it was, obviously not being a physicist and not understanding the mathematics involved. To hear her, obviously in lay terms, explain how the standard model of physics addresses these questions and the conclusions, if not answers, conclusions that you come to about it. A lot of them were not what I expected. You hear some of these, and again, some of those titles, why don't people ever get younger, or can we create a universe? These sorts of things. You go, well, of course not. But then she dives into the math and she says, well, actually, according to the standard model of physics, if we had this much matter, we could create a universe. There's nothing that says we can't, know?
Right. She doesn't just shut the door on everything. There are a couple of things she shuts down. But and the way that the book is constructed, I love this. This is a book that aren't you lucky, former students? I didn't have you reading this one because I would have. Because it is constructed for dialogue. It is constructed for accumulative and recursive thinking, so that at the there's a bit of an introduction to the chapter, but at the very end of the chapter, she has a section. Each chapter, even after interviews, sections that she's done, and she calls it the brief answer. I would have everyone read the brief answer first, and then go back and encounter the chapter, and then go back and say, now what do you think of the brief answer?
Yeah.
Because it orients one to where she's going, why she's talking about what she is, and really, the brief answer is the rarefied philosophical droplet that the whole, if the chapter were a nice drink in a glass, this little droplet would be the absolute taste. It tells you, like she says in one chapter, this is let's see, here we go. Is consciousness computable? If consciousness emerges from fundamental laws of physics that we already know, it is computable. However, the update of the wave function in quantum mechanics might signal that we are missing some part of the story, and this missing part might be uncomputable. If that is so, consciousness might also be uncomputable, and so on. But here are the mights and the maybes and the we don't know for sure or at all.
Yeah, and I think that that's what I like is if you look at the brief answers, if you were to do that, read the brief answer first, I think that's where a lot of people would be shocked. Kind of like reading the headline of a popular science article in your news feed, right? All of a sudden you read it, you go, wait, what the heck? What does that mean? But then when you go through and you read the whole chapter, you go, oh, okay, now that makes a little more sense. What's being said. But yeah, there's a lot of things like that. The consciousness was a good one. This idea of consciousness being computable. And we'll probably get into it a little bit later in the episode. But again, there's this struggle between the philosopher and the physicist, right? And so I think it might bear asking, what does the book have to do with philosophy? Does philosophy have a place in it?
Very much so, from my view. I don't want to hear what you think about it because I think I know, but I want to hear it because it's not that she name drops. It's not a primer or primer, as some folks say, in philosophy. It's not here's the basics of what you need to know. She assumes a background knowledge, but she also, when she mentions a name, she tells you something that they were talking about. And it's up to you to go out and find that if you want to. But she keeps going back in each chapter to the rooted idea that physics is working with, but the idea came out of philosophy. And so she's really saying we wouldn't be at this question point. I think she's saying, this is how I take it, unless we had people a long time ago begin to ask these questions and form this conceptual framework for us that, by the way, still pretty much works. So she's not saying that Western philosophy is the be all and end all, but she is giving lots of due notice that like it or not, this is where these questions emerged in our experience of culture.
Yeah. To me, I think that there's a split personality thing going on a little bit, because I think that you're right. I think that a lot of what you just said is implied in the writing, but then many of the direct, when philosophy is directly addressed, it's I wouldn't say in a disparaging way, but it's
poking.
Yeah, because I think that, again, a physicist looks at philosophy as something that is quite literally half-baked, right? You have ideas, but you don't have any mathematics or you don't have anything to back up these ideas. So that's where physics comes in. We take care of that section of it. So as a result, philosophers, they're not doing something bad, but they're doing something that to some extent is lesser or, is...
Yeah, she does have, I agree with you. She has that. So that, well, I mentioned this too before we got on starting this, that in one of her other books, which was about math, she said that a book, you read a book 1,000 people read the book, it's a different book for each of those people. If you read an equation, it's the same for everybody. So that asserts a primacy of the equation over.
Yeah. And, I'm in my studies, I'm seeing a lot more of this. Psychology has an interesting history, and it's following in the same sort of way where, behavioralism or this sort of mechanistic view of humanity was very popular in the 20th century. And that sort of conception, okay, well, we can use, it's all stimulus. If you're on the nature or the nurture side of it, it's all stimulus and response, or if you're on the nature side of it, it's all genetics, can explain human behavior.
Yes.
And they found that's not really the case. There's an interaction that it goes beyond that. And there's been other frameworks that have been better able to explain behavior. But this idea of, it's difficult, right? Because physics it's a reductionist sort of science. And she talks about this in the book, Infinite Reductionism, right? And that's part of this issue is, okay, well, physics and our sciences and the standard model of physics certainly is built around this breaking things down into smaller parts. But does there come a point where you can't break them down any smaller? And if there is such a point, what does that say for everything that's been built on top of it, right? So I think that, I think she might have a complicated relationship with philosophy in that way, where obviously to look at it, to a book called Existential Physics, right? She's going beyond just the mechanistic view of the science of physics. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, as a physicist, there is some loyalty or some perspective that is locked into the split reductionist mechanistic view of how things work. So it's really quite fascinating to read it and to see how she kind of addresses some of those issues.
You're saying that very well, because I think she'd be nodding. I'd like to think she'd be nodding.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think I would really like the listeners to read the book, because I know for me it's the kind of thing where it's like, man, I hope she doesn't listen to this podcast.
I kind of hope she does,
because that's the thing is I think what she thinks about philosophy, or what she would even think about our critique of her book. I'm not sure that she would like it.
I'm not interested if she'd like it, but I think that we were doing something. Of course, there's a difference, because I'm a teacher.
Right.
I'm certainly not. I didn't mean that in a glib way. I'm not interested in what she's. Of course, I'm interested in what she'd say, but we're not saying this so that she would like it, and she's not saying the things because she wants everybody to like what she's saying either. I think the fact that we're engaging with it, is really the purpose. And even the title, I find interesting, and I would ask her if I had the opportunity. She provides a nice, a cogent, brief glossary of terms. She doesn't put existentialism in that glossary. And the title of the book is Existential Physics. And if we go back to what existentialism is, it is in part the view that the universe cares not for us, is not about us. And if we find any meaning in it, it's up to us to find it. It's not that the universe is going to hand it to us.
Yeah, the title is fascinating because, like we've mentioned, physics is sort of the foundational science. So it's like the initial point of scientific explanation of the universe. Mm-hmm. Existentialism, as far as philosophical schools of thought go, is probably one of the least explanatory in nature, because it doesn't really address where did the universe come from, where did people come from. It's much more subjectively based, right? It's an introspective sort of saying, listen, what does it mean to exist? It doesn't go into any of the things that physics does. So this idea of merging them, of saying existential physics, as a subjective, introspective look at what it means to be human within this embedded idea of explaining all of these big things. It's kind of an interesting term.
It is. And this is why, except for a few moments here and there, which we have mentioned already, she leaves one in that ending of any particular chapter. She leaves one with not an absolute certainty. Sometimes she'll essentially say, well, whether or not we can change the nature of time, what does that have to do with how we're living?
Yeah.
If you were a brain in a vat, what difference would it make?
Yeah.
And I think that those kind of, I'm looking at the math one. We use mathematics to describe our observations. The physicists do. But we don't know why some math describes reality where other math doesn't. One can therefore attribute a moment of creation specifically to the math that describes what we observe, a moment at which the math becomes real. Such a creation event is by construction not observable, otherwise it would have been described by the math already, and is therefore compatible with science. So what she's saying is math is emergent. Not the way she uses the word emergent, but there's a creative element. And she's in that chapter, she's trying to say, she talks about creationism. She talks about the Big Bang. She talks about some people seem to want to believe. And then she's trying to say, well, here's what physics allows, and here's what physics really doesn't.
Yeah, and that's where the paradoxical nature of the writing comes in, I think, right? Is because she's very quick to, quite frankly, address fellow physicists overstepping of the bounds of
like
science.
Carlo Rovelli.
Yeah. She's quick to go in and say, hey, listen, these ideas of multiverses or big bounces or any of these other things, they're ascientific. They don't reflect what we know. The only thing that we need to describe the world we live in is, what happened from the Planck length on. Anything before that is just speculation. It's just philosophy, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's that aspect of it. Clearly delineating what is science and what isn't. But then the relationship with that big chunk of what isn't science, right? I think that's where some of her writing gets interesting is how she addresses, because some of it is sort of dismissive or sort of disparaging, but then the other part of it, like you said, is this idea that, well, that's the existential part, right? There's the existential and there's the physics, and I'm not even sure if they're meant to be merged the way that she has them in the title. That's where the difficulty with me with the reading is does she want them to be separate or does she want them to be merged in her?
I think that's an excellent question, and I don't know how she'd respond to that, but I'm guessing there would be a little bit of a smile, or shaking of the head, or what. But
I think there'd be a lot of shaking of the head.
There'd be a lot of shaking of the head. Chapter 7 was the universe made for us. In one sense, I think that's really, for me, the anchor point for the title of the book. When she says we have no reason to think the universe was made especially for us or for life in general. So essentially in one sentence, she doesn't mention it, but she sort of gives the anthropic principle a kind of kick and says, so what?
Yeah.
It is, however, possible that our current theories are missing something essential about how the laws of nature give rise to complexity in our universe. Maybe the fact that this growth is possible at all will one day give rise to better explanation. Still, no scientific theory will ever be able to answer all questions. That's because for it to be scientific, it must have been selected by its success in explaining observations. But then it will necessarily bounce back some questions with the answer, essentially, why? Because it's what we observe. Well, if we can't explain everything that we observe, then there's more than science. Or there's more science that hasn't yet happened. There's more math. that hasn't yet taken place. So yes, you're right. It's like the left brain, right brain go.
Yeah. Yeah. And my developmental psychology book gave a sort of a very good illustration of the problem here. And which is that the standard model of physics is reductionist, which essentially says, and she uses this example in the book as sort of her view of the progression of science, which is that, listen, there was a Big Bang. There was an initial state of the universe. There's a Big Bang, and then everything that's progressed since that point is deterministic. Things have, because of those initial states, they have progressed and will progress in a certain way until the end of time. My developmental psychology book takes issue with this because that was sort of, and that's what behaviorism and the mechanistic view of the human was based on. I said, well, the reason this doesn't work is because it's essentially additive in nature, right? Okay, so you have all of the particles in the universe. They're all moving in a certain way. Yep. And if you add that momentum and those particles, you end up with something. They said, well, that's not really the case because, if you add a bunch of oranges together, you don't get a motorcycle. There's emergent properties, right? The clearest one is water, right? You have hydrogen, which is a gas, and you have oxygen, which is a gas. And when you put them together, they have this liquid property. And that's an emergent property. It's not something that's inherent in either one of the other ones. And so they said, well, that's kind of the problem with the standard model of physics, is that as you start adding stuff together, you don't just get the sum of the addition. You have these emergent properties that come out at each level of these mergers that the standard model can't really quite account for. And I think that's some of the stuff that she addresses with the mights and maybes and
I think so.
In the book is these things where, and she mentions it in the book. Even as a physicist, I mean, this is what she makes her living doing, right? She says, at some point, we're going to have to tear the standard model down, most likely. She said it's not going to answer the questions we need it to answer. Oh, that's a pretty brave thing to say.
It is, but it goes back to other things we have discussed in the past about the scaffolding of knowledge, about you're never going to get to the place. Infinity is a long time. Yeah. You're never going to get to the place where everything is known. And that's why we exist doing this every week, isn't it? Because we poke and we ask and we play and we talk, knowing that we're not going to absolutely know, knowing that there are going to be even more questions when we end up. That's the fun.
Yeah. Yeah. And, and to that end, she takes issue with, I think that she is consistent in that regard, where she says, listen, the standard model of physics isn't going to answer what we want to answer. And then she kind of goes after physicists that are just creating new particles, theoretical physics, right? Her and Sheldon Cooper would not get along, right? Because she says, listen, now we're just creating particles just for the sake of creating particles, or, we're essentially letting the holes in the theory dictate what we're creating in order to fill those gaps, rather than basing it on observable experimental.
Yes, because the relatively is a big word here. It's a relatively simpler answer. It's where where she reminds me of some of my the joy I take in detective fiction, or Sherlock Holmes. The answer, no matter how unlikely, if you've investigated everything else, must be the truth. She's not really doing that. She's saying the simpler answer is better than the other one. You don't want to go to the Gordian knot. You don't need to make this more complex. And that's where we start inventing things and mixing it up. And she does go after some of her fellow physicist writers, and in a kind of fun way. But where she's philosophical for me too is where she just keeps coming back to the idea of defining. The one point she says in the "Has Physics Ruled Out Free Will" chapter. Having said that, I don't have a big problem with physicists or philosophers' compatibilist definitions of free will. After all, they're just definitions, neither right nor wrong, merely more or less useful. But I don't think such verbal acrobatics address the issue that normal people, non-philosophers, worry about. That's where she's being, snarky. Yeah. She's being snarky. But when she points out that the definitions are about trying to figure out a useful starting place for a conversation. That's philosophy itself. Let's
Yeah,
define
yeah.
the terms.
No, yeah, she's using philosophical tools in her approach. Occam's razor, is this idea of the simpler answer is the right one. She uses that many times, saying, well, could we explain what we see with this, this, and this? Yeah, but it's much more simple to just say this thing that we already have that explains it is the right answer, even though it doesn't go back and explain the initial part. Or, like you just mentioned, I just lost it. When she's talking about
compatibilism.
Oh, no. Theories, right? Oh. This idea that a theory, whether right or wrong, isn't necessarily what's cogent to the theory. It's usefulness, right? And that's a philosophical stance, right? Is saying, okay, well, what theory explains most of what we say? What theory is most useful to what we're doing? And in that regard, that's not necessarily a scientific position so much as a philosophical one, because you could have a theory that doesn't necessarily have as strong a scientific basis, but if it explains more of what you see in terms of free will or whatever, then sure, why not operate under that theoretical
even if it runs us against a wall and an opposite theory comes into being, and so it's imitative of reality, or points us toward. We talked about this in an episode, many episodes back, where we are looking for something that seems to be credibly realistic at the moment. And I think that's what she's going for us at the moment. This seems to be the most elegantly, relatively simple, that we don't need all of this other clutter.
Yeah.
And when we clutter it up with anti or scientific conceptualizations, that's fun. You can go out and play and do all that, but just don't tell yourself you're being scientific, because you're not. And I think that's where I love it, because she gets to when I was spending time teaching science writing classes, or writing in the sciences, and trying to point out those things are not the same. Writing in the sciences is not the same as science writing. Writing about the sciences is not the same as actually performing a study.
Yeah, so you heard it here first, folks. Here's a couple philosophers endorsing the removal of philosophy from scientific, which again is not to say, we talk many times about how science is built on philosophy, but there's a difference between scientific endeavors being built on philosophical thought and the idea of integrating your idiographic or personal philosophy into your extrapolation of scientific findings. Two very different things. And so science being built on philosophy is great. As a matter of fact, there's even a scientific term for that. It's called meta-theories, right? Which a meta-theory is a theory of theories, which is a fancy way of saying your philosophy, right? Like, what is your theory of how theories work? That's your philosophy.
That's your philosophy.
So humans are naturally subjective creatures. We have initial conceptions, preconceptions and things. And that informs the very first step of the scientific method, which is hypothesizing, right? We all look at our reality and we say, well, where did this come from, or how does that work? And then we try to describe or explain or experiment in order to figure out the answer to that question. So yes, science does originate from philosophy there. But I think the important part is to understand that that's where philosophy belongs in the process. It's at the beginning, asking those questions. Philosophy does not belong in the process where after you perform that experiment, and then after you have the answers, trying to attribute something to those answers that the data does not say. And that's what she takes issue with, and that's what we also take issue with.
Yes, it is. I very much enjoyed when she, as a science popularizer in her writing, she takes on the idea of metaphors, acknowledges that she uses metaphors like any popularizer would, and at the same time says, but metaphors, of course, as we know, are not the reality itself, because if they were, we wouldn't need the metaphor.
Right.
and so, but philosophy, as we know all the way, and she talks about this, but we talk about it often. The models, Plato's cave, or the ship of Theseus, or Occam's razor, or these work to help us think, but they certainly aren't the science themselves.
Yeah.
And so there is a very healthy relationship between the two things.
Yeah. So what was your favorite part of the book?
Well, I initially I was just about to say, but no. When she was talking about multiverses, I thought it would be. It wasn't for me. It actually was. Has physics ruled out free will? Because of the concentration on compatibilism, and of course she cherry picks and finds the philosophers that she likes, like Immanuel Kant, who was poo-pooing free will. But it made me think. She made me think freshly about it. It's going to sound goofy to say, but there are times when it's really hard to come at some ingrained idea freshly, and that's so important that we do that as we get older, as we get more widely read. One mustn't get stodgy, as they say on British recipes shows. And she made me think freshly about this idea of compatibilism. And she points out that the compatibilism is about 59 or 60% of people seem to take the position. Well, there's free will, and then there's determinism. And she's had enough of that and said, well, okay, fine. But if you're going with the science, physics pretty much shows us that free will doesn't exist. That the movement of particles into all over to the coarse-grained levels would show us that things are pretty much determined. And what I appreciate about this chapter, and she didn't explicitly go there, but she took me there on my own path. She let me go out on my own path with this. I started to rethink the term will and free will. And to me, I came to the point, thanks to her, even though she didn't say it, that will is actually the deterministic part. Now, you and I were talking earlier about genotypes and phenotypes, and so I'm not suggesting that will is based solely on genetics or anything like that, but to me it seems like, and this is probably going to be metaphorical and mushy, it seems that the will is the thing that we try to counter sometimes by the attempt to make choices. Will is already the given to me now, having read this, and choice is that thing that, so when people say, well, they're going on a diet and they're using willpower, I don't think it's willpower. I think the will of the body is saying, nope, I want to eat this and I want to eat that because, of course, it's winter and it's cold and it's going to feel good and I need the extra, whatever it happens to be. It's the choice power that says, despite the deterministic will of my being and my makeup, and the way I am because of my culture, I'm going to try to choose something that I might not normally choose. And that, that's nothing new in that, but for me, it worked.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting take on it. And I think that does highlight a different aspect of it. Like, the history of philosophy is essentially the battle between rationalism and empiricism, and different generations of philosophers taking up this battle throughout time. And a lot of that battle between the two is free will versus determinism. So it's been talked about so many times, so many different ways. And we've progressed in the philosophical thought, we've progressed in the scientific thought. But yeah, there is a need to look at it differently. And I think that your view is a fresh view. And I'm thinking about what I'm learning in the developmental psychology class I'm taking, right? Which is that The writer of the book rails against behaviorism and the mechanistic view of humanity, the deterministic view of humanity, essentially saying that, if it's a nature-based behaviorist view, that your genes determine all of your behavior, or if you're a nurture-based view of genetic determinism, stimulus response determines all of your behavior. But the author of the book, in railing against those things, talks about how it's not nature-nurture, it's both of them, right? So you have a genetic code, but your genes aren't a static thing. Your environment, which is nurture, right? The stimulus in your environment turns genes on and off. And so as a result, whatever your genetic code says doesn't matter as much as which genes are turned on and off. And then how your environment and your genetic methylization is interacting. And even how your own thoughts, your own psychology are interpreting your environment. And then through that, through the stress response, essentially, determining what your genes are doing through epigenetic behaviors. So, but what's funny about that, right, is in railing against the deterministic view, what are they using? What are the actual tools that they're using to rail against it? It's nature and nurture. But is there suddenly free will in there? Did that suddenly pop out? No, it didn't, right? There's still an environment. There's still a genetic code. And there's a psychological element. There's my interpretation of the environment in conjunction with my genetic code, creating an epigenetic sort of ontogeny that goes throughout my life. But that doesn't necessarily address free will or determinism at all, right? All it does is phrase it in a different way that doesn't split nature from nurture. So, yes, what the science tells us, whether it's physics or psychology or whatever, it has a way of drastically affecting our philosophical views. And I think that you're right. That is a great part of what the book accomplishes.
Now you're putting me in mind of the meme you showed me today. So describe that meme. It's out of an old movie.
Yeah. So it's a meme of the Boondock Saints, and I'm sure everybody's seen it. It's the scene where they're sitting in a church or whatever, and a girl has a gun to the back of a guy's head.
He's in a front pew. She's in the next pew behind.
And then behind her, there's somebody else with a gun to her head. And then up in a balcony, there's a guy with a gun pointed at her head, right? And so it keeps going back. And usually the format of the meme is that each person has something written on them to explain it. So the guy in the first pew has biology written on him. The girl behind him has biology is just applied chemistry. The girl behind her has chemistry is just applied physics. The guy behind her has physics is just applied mathematics. The guy behind him has mathematics is just applied philosophy. And the guy behind him has philosophy is just a byproduct of misunderstanding language.
See, and it goes with Sabine Hossenfelder's.
Yeah.
I think her intent.
That is existential physics to some extent. And that's the thing is, I mean, if you look at psychology is great, right? Because if you are a behavioral psychologist, what separates you from being a physicist, essentially? If you think that essentially it's just all molecular additive cell determinism, then a physicist like Sabine Hossenfelder should be able to tell us everything we need to know about psychology by knowing the initial states of the universe, right? And of course, that's with a lot of assumptions about the mathematics and the physics that we don't necessarily have.
Yeah, I was just sitting here thinking she would say as she did herself.
Right.
Well, you can't. One of the reasons she says we can't be, you can nurture the idea all you want to and play with it in your head, but in terms of scientifically, we cannot be in a simulation because we don't have the capacity to put consciousness into a machine and to determine the movements of all the air molecules and That's what you were just saying.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, theoretically, a physicist should be able to tell us everything we need to know about psychology, but there are obvious limitations that affect that. If you believe that, that is a behaviorist or a deterministic viewpoint. Now, like we just talked about, your view of philosophy was changed by reading the book in regard to the idea of free will and determinism. What are some ways your views about science changed by reading the book?
Not so much for me changed, but enhanced, because I've done a lot of popularized science reading of science writers who write for people to become more familiar with and to think about concepts. And so it's not like she's the first person who's done this. John Horgan, Lawrence Krauss, all kinds of Diane Ackerman, endless, essentially, list. But in her own way, she does it a little bit differently. There's a cutting through conceptually that I don't find in some of the other writers. She's much less poetic than Carlo Rovelli, and I still enjoy it. Whatever Sabine Hossenfelder thinks, I still like reading Carlo Rovelli. But I think that it's not new, but I think there's an enhancement going on of re-inviting me to think about the philosophy itself and the relationship with science. And I don't always do that every time I'm reading a popularized science. So that, I think for me, that's it. It's that she has dared to, and in fact, challenged us to.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I think that the same thing holds true for me. It's this idea of enhanced criticality, right? As a philosopher, we're always trying to be critical, not in a negative sense, but in the sense of we want to look at something and see it for what it actually is, rather than for what we assume that it is. But despite that good intention, people are subjective creatures. We all have biases. We all have, like you and I talked about before the show, stereotypes and things, right? And so when we're presented with concepts, we have a natural inclination to believe or object or to make something new out of it based off of our prior learning and preconceptions. Mm-hmm. What she really did for me with both science and philosophy, reading the book, is the way that she was able to look at things and separate things and explain things, was to give me a better philosophical tool set for addressing scientific issues, right? I love reading popular science articles in the news, right? But that natural inclination that I have towards those things, I realized necessarily caused me to lose some objective perspective to the meaning that they had.
Yes,
right?
The scientific undergirding that they are avoiding, or putting sort of in the background, which she was taking issue with.
So, which isn't to say that those articles are bad in and of themselves, right? Now, yes, they're meant to grab readers. They're meant to have these inspiring or fascinating titles and headlines and things. And, and she rightly goes in and explains with Occam's razor, with, theoretical usefulness, why these things are unnecessary to science. And that part was very important for me to read, is to say, okay, no, we do have philosophical tools that allow us to determine whether or not we should be giving scientific gravitas to certain ideas, or whether or not they're just philosophical conceptions. But, like I said, separating the two is very important, but just because they're separate doesn't mean that the philosophical conceptions raised by this popular scientific article isn't cool and useful to a theoretical or abstract thought progression in and of itself, So I think that was the real value of the book for me, was looking at it and saying, okay, just because a popular science article, just because they did an experiment, and they had these results, doesn't mean that the conclusions that they're telling me to believe in this article is what the experiment actually said. It might be something much less. But even because it is something much less, that doesn't necessarily mean that what the scientists said after that isn't a cool philosophical idea that other experiments could jump off from and attempt to.
You've caught that very well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that I very much think that's what she's doing. I can almost hear in my head, I'm not putting words in her mouth, but I just, how the trite phrases that we use, thinking out of the box. I think Hossenfelder is saying to me, think out of the box all you want. There's still the box, because math makes the box.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
You're still in the box.
Right.
If you can think out of it, fine, but you're still there.
Yeah. No, exactly. So this was fun. We've looked at TV shows. We've looked at movie clips. This was our first kind of book review, and I'd be interested in doing more of them in the future. So it's a great book. If you want to read it, Existential Physics by Sabine Hossenfelder. And until next time, keep on.